His own family tried to have him committed. His enemies confirmed he was real. He never wrote a single word. And more has been written about him than about any other person who ever lived. We have a problem. Here is what nobody tells you when they tell you about Jesus. His own brothers, the people who grew up with him, who ate at the same table, who knew his voice when he was tired, thought he had lost his mind. Mark chapter 3. His family comes to take him away. He is out of his mind. They are words in the gospel. By the end of this, you are going to know 5 things about Jesus that most people who have read about him their entire lives have never been told. And none of them will make him smaller. So let's start simple. What do we actually know? Jesus of Nazareth was real. That's not really debated. Different sources, Jewish, Roman, early Christian, all point to the same thing. He existed. He was probably born somewhere between 6 and 4 BC, which is strange because it means he was born before the year we named after him. That's just a calendar mistake from much later. He grew up in Nazareth. And Nazareth? That wasn't important. We're talking a small village, maybe a few hundred people. There's even a line. Can anything good come from Nazareth? That wasn't sarcasm. That was how people actually saw it. He worked with his hands. The word used is tekton, someone who builds, works with wood, stone. So this wasn't a philosopher in a library. This was someone who spent years doing physical work. And then, his public life? 2, maybe 3 years. That's it. And somehow, that was enough to change everything. Here is what makes the historical Jesus almost unique in ancient history. His enemies confirmed him. Tacitus, Rome's greatest historian, writing around 116 AD, he hated Christians, called them a class hated for their abominations. He is not a fan. And yet, he writes about Christus, executed under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. He confirms the execution. He confirms the movement survived it. A hostile Roman senator, writing 80 years after the crucifixion, confirms the core of the story. Josephus, the Jewish historian who never converted. He mentions Jesus twice. He calls James the brother of Jesus who was called Christ. A non-Christian confirms the family connection. You don't need to believe anything to accept that this man existed.
his opponents left the proof.
So, how close do we actually get to eyewitnesses? Closer than you might think, but not directly. The earliest sources we have come about 20 years later, mostly from Paul. And yes, he knew people who knew Jesus. Peter, James. But he didn't meet Jesus during his lifetime. His experience was different. A vision. At least, that's how he describes it. Then come the Gospels, written decades later by authors who didn't even sign their names. So what you have is a chain. Someone sees something. They tell others. Those people repeat it. Communities preserve it. And only later, it gets written down. And that changes everything.
Now, here's what makes this really unusual. Jesus isn't only mentioned by people who believed in him. He's mentioned by people who had every reason not to. Roman writers, officials, people who didn't support this movement and didn't like it. And yet, they still talk about him as a real established figure. Take Tacitus, one of Rome's most respected historians. Writing around the year 116, he describes the execution of Christus under Pontius Pilate. And he's not trying to promote anything. He actually calls Christians a group hated for what they believed. He doesn't like them, but he still confirms it happened. The execution, Pilate, the movement continuing after. Then there's Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor, writing to the emperor, trying to figure out what to do with Christians. He describes the meeting before dawn, singing to Christ like he's a god. He doesn't admire it. He sees it as a problem, something inconvenient. But still, he confirms they existed and that they were devoted enough to gather before sunrise and worship. And then Josephus, a Jewish historian, not a Christian. He mentions Jesus more than once. Now, yes, one of those passages was probably edited later, but most scholars agree there's still something original there, a real reference from someone who wasn't part of the movement. So think about what that means. The historical Jesus is confirmed by the people who opposed him. And that almost never happens.
Now, here's the detail almost nobody talks about. During his lifetime, his own family didn't believe in him. Not strangers, not critics. His family. There's a line. Even his own brothers did not believe in him. Let that sink in. The people who grew up with him, who saw him every day, who sat at the same table, who knew what his voice sounded like when he was tired, they weren't convinced. At one point, they actually come to take him away because they think he's lost his mind. That's in the text.
hidden, not softened. And then something changes. Because one of those same brothers, James, who didn't believe before, becomes a leader after. Not just a follower, a leader in Jerusalem. And eventually, he dies for it. So the real question isn't, did people believe? The real question is, what happened between he's lost his mind and I'm willing to die for this? Because whatever that was, that's the center of the entire story.
If you've been following this series, you already know how we do this. We don't just repeat the story. We go into the details. Most people skip. The small lines. The uncomfortable parts. And we actually take them seriously. So, if that's interesting to you, stay with me. Because what comes next is where it gets even more intense. So, what was he actually teaching? If you strip everything away, what's left? Stories. Simple ones. A farmer planting seeds. A woman searching for a lost coin. A father waiting for a son who left. But here's the thing. They're not just simple. They're disruptive. They flip expectations. The person you expect to be right isn't. The person you expect to fail becomes the hero. The outsider helps. The respected people walk past. And then there's how he lived. He eats with tax collectors. People everyone hated. He touches the sick. People others wouldn't even go near. And not by accident. Deliberately. He speaks to women in public. He crosses social boundaries. He talks to people his culture said to avoid. Again and again. So, whatever else he wasn't safe. He wasn't predictable. He kept pushing against everything around him. And that kind of person doesn't get ignored for long.
Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect who ordered the crucifixion, for a long time was thought by some historians to be almost semi-legendary. Then, in 1961, Italian archaeologists digging in Caesarea Maritima, the city built by Herod the Great, found a stone inscription. Limestone, carved in Latin. Damaged, but still readable. Pontius Pilatus, Prefectus Judaeae. Pilate's name. His official title. A real administrative record of the man who signed the execution order. That stone is now in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. It still exists. You can literally see it. And what that means is simple. The man who ordered the crucifixion left his name carved in stone in the same world where all of this happened. This story is not mythology. It is archaeology. It is stone. It is history.
The crucifixion. Whatever else you believe about it, the historical fact itself is not debated. Jesus of Nazareth was executed by Roman crucifixion. Under Pontius Pilate, in Jerusalem, during the reign of Tiberius Caesar, around 30 to 33 AD. Now, crucifixion wasn't just execution. It was humiliation. A method reserved for slaves, rebels, the lowest status people. Designed not only to kill, but to destroy dignity. Public, slow, brutal. And here's where the story becomes strange. Because within weeks of this execution, his followers are openly saying, in the same city where it happened, to people who could verify it themselves, that he is alive. Not somewhere distant, not generations later, right there in Jerusalem. And somehow, a group of people who were afraid, who were hiding, become people willing to die for what they claim they saw. Something changed them. That part is not theory. It is the historical tension in the record. And James, his own brother, is part of that evidence. He didn't believe during the ministry.
Here's something that changes how you see all of this. Jesus didn't operate in the center of power. Almost his entire ministry was in Galilee, not Jerusalem. Galilee. And that matters, because Galilee wasn't respected in the same way. It was rural, provincial. Even the accent was noticeable, different from Jerusalem's speech. There's a moment in the text where someone recognizes Peter just by how he speaks. Your accent gives you away. So imagine this. A group of working-class Galileans, fishermen, craftsmen, ordinary people, walk into Jerusalem, the religious and political center, and start speaking like they matter. At first, they're not taken seriously. But that doesn't last forever, because the movement they start doesn't stay small.
What happens next is almost hard to explain. A movement with no army, no political structure, no institutional backing starts spreading fast across regions, across cultures. Within a few hundred years, it becomes the dominant religious force in the Roman world. And over time, it spreads across continents. Today, billions of people identify with it. One of the largest belief systems in human history. And it traces back to a man from a small village who wrote nothing, had no formal power, and died a humiliating death. There is no clean parallel to that.
So here's the question I keep coming back to. He wrote nothing. His family didn't believe at first.
He had no system, no structure, no political power. And yet, people around him changed. Not slightly, completely. I've spent this whole series looking at the people closest to him. And none of them should have mattered historically. But they did. Something happened to them. Something they couldn't unsee. Something they couldn't undo. Whatever that was, it was enough. And this is where one chapter ends. But one question keeps repeating underneath everything. The temple. Herod's temple. The center of the entire world they lived in. That's where the next part begins. Not just the story, but the structure itself. How it was built. What it represented. And why it still matters. He wrote nothing. Not a single surviving word in his own hand. And yet here we are, 2,000 years later, still talking about what other people remembered him saying. So here's the question. Is that a weakness in the record? Or is that the entire point? That the message wasn't meant to stay on paper, but inside people. Tell me what you think. I read every comment.